Hi, everyone. Welcome to a presentation topic today on the power of proactive penetration testing. My name is Mitch Kelsey. I'm a cybersecurity advisor and tenable guardian here at CDW Canada. I'm glad to have you join me for the presentation today. So let me briefly introduce who I am prior to getting into the agenda and the conversation, just so that we can help orient the conversation here. So I represent risk advisory and enterprise security services at CDW Canada. So that includes our penetration testing practice for the purposes of today's conversation, but we also cover governance, risk, and compliance consulting, as well as vulnerability management and security strategy conversations. We're effectively the vendor independent arm of our security organization that helps organizations either understand your current security posture and potential gaps in it today, or to help you achieve target objectives. As I mentioned, I am CDW, or Canada's only tenable guardian. So in the vulnerability management space, I tend to lead in those conversations as well. You might have seen other presentations from me on those topics. I have a slightly different background in security than some of my colleagues here at CDW or elsewhere. I got started in the national security, intelligence, and counterterrorism space, and gravitated into cybersecurity as a result of that. So I tend to think of security topics a little bit differently, more from how an external actor is going to identify potential challenges in your organization, how to best organize risk to be able to address what's most impactful to your organization, and how those things interplay, because there's always complexity there. We'll get into that a little bit later on. And lastly, when I'm not talking about cybersecurity, you can find me playing soccer or creating in the kitchen or spending time with my wife, my two little boys, and our bulldog Moose. So let's quickly cover the agenda here. So I briefly already introduced myself. We're going to talk about penetration testing from a primer perspective, what it is, what are the domains we should be focused on, why this is important. We're going to talk about how organizations take that information and others to build blocks for security maturity. How do we get to understand the problems we're trying to solve? What is capability maturity and how is that measured? And what are the values of moving in that direction? And how do we get to a roadmap to tackle the things that are identified as part of these exercises? We're going to get into more detail about technical security testing, so understanding the value and the purpose of baselining information security risk, how penetration testing acts as an input for the rest of your security practice, and focus a little bit on where practice makes progress, how we can help you as an organization push the needle on your security posture to continue that improvement. Lastly, we're going to arm you with some information that you can take with you when you're evaluating penetration testing partners. So what should you be looking for in a penetration test itself, as well as the vendors that are going to provide that to you. And then I'm going to introduce our own risk advisory services practice here at CDW and have some questions and answer period available at the end in case anybody has questions. So in terms of where penetration testing is, I like this graphic as a starting point. It's one of those things out in the market that there's not a clear single definition for what is a pen test. There's a lot of things that fall into it. We're going to get into effectively what should be in a pen test, but it's a bit of a vague concept to some people. So I'm glad we're having the chance to break that down ahead of time. So what is a pen test? Let's talk about how this fits into your security posture more generally. So when we help organizations assess aspects of their security organization, one of the ways that we can do that is taking an attacker's perspective. So viewing an aspect of your target environment, whether you're talking about your network and infrastructure, an application that's important to you, if we're looking at assessing other aspects of your security posture, perhaps the susceptibility of your users to getting socially engineered. It's a little bit adjacent to pen testing, but oftentimes we'll talk about those things together. And all these are a good way to assess the current posture of your attack surface management. So how well have you as an organization identified, classified, prioritized, and managed those surfaces that are most important to the way that you do business? Do you have a good idea of how an attacker would leverage the information that's there and what the risks are to the things that are most important to how you do what you do? Penetration testing is intended to be an iterative assessment to allow you to focus on priorities as they change over time and build your security posture based on identifying the things that are going to have the biggest impact to mitigating risk in your environment. It also helps us understand what vulnerabilities or gaps we have in our existing security posture today. There's likely ones that organizationally you're aware of, and there's also going to be ones that you may not be aware of, or you may not understand the severity of something because it doesn't have the attack context that a penetration test can provide. And so by going through this effort, we can identify how risky those gaps are and what we could reasonably expect a threat actor to do with that information. When we are looking at most types of penetration testing, we often start with what's called the Pentest standard. I've laid it out here below, but it's the steps that we take to help identify and lay out effectively the same type of assessment that we would against lots of different types of organizations, but doing so in a measured way so that we can demonstrate what that would look like in a way that's going to be understandable by both technical and non-technical folks when we get to the reporting stage at the end. So we have to talk about pre-engagement. We have to understand what's important to your organization, why we're doing the testing, whether it's something that you've done before, how confident are you in the security controls you have today. Then the team's job is to go out and gather intelligence about the organization. What do we know today? Is this something where we're doing a zero knowledge test, where we're given the IP addresses or a URL to a target application, and we're expected to act as if an attacker didn't know anything? Or do we have a closer to a full knowledge test where we're provided a lot of information that the expectation that an attacker, if they really wanted to spend the time and effort to gather, they could probably do that. And increasingly, organizations are providing that to us so that we can focus on pretending to be the bad guy and not doing the research that they expect that we would be able to gather as a threat actor. We have to go through threat modeling. We have to understand why we would want to target certain aspects, which things might be important to others. This is particularly important in the application testing space because depending on the reason why we're conducting testing, there may be things that we want to focus on more or less in that engagement, and do that in accordance to what threats we expect against that infrastructure and what we're trying to demonstrate in terms of the security controls that are supposed to be there to protect it. Once we have that, then we want to assess the vulnerabilities of the target that is in front of us. So what potential information might be disclosed about it? Is there outdated software or outdated functionality that exists within the application hardware perhaps that is missing patches or is no longer supported by the vendor? Is it a misconfiguration where perhaps aspects of the application were lit up in a way that it's allowing insecure access to it? Perhaps historically it was needed to be able to communicate. It may not be anymore, but that information is still out there. Or perhaps it's a device that is still using default credentials. We need to gather all of the information that we need to know about a particular target so that we can go through and put our attack plan together to demonstrate what the bad guys would do. Once we have that together, then we move towards exploitation. So actually taking those vulnerabilities and exploiting them in the target environment to demonstrate what would happen if an attacker did this. And that's usually just the first step. We call that a foothold to say, where's the leverage point that an attacker is going to get in to then take next steps in the environment. Those next steps are post-exploitation. So usually the case is they want to move laterally, jump around the network to get access to different resources than the first machine they started on. They want to escalate their privileges. They want to be able to get access to administrative functionality or super user functionality to be able to perform tasks that maybe they couldn't when they first were able to exploit that initial vulnerability. To also look at identifying what potential information they want to gather. What are the valuable things in this organization that they want to go after? Is it intellectual property? Are we talking about personally identifiable information? Is it a case where they're looking to deploy ransomware to be able to lock up the infrastructure and hold it hostage? All of these steps happen after that exploitation phase. And these two steps here that I've highlighted in red really differentiate a penetration test from a vulnerability scanner or a vulnerability assessment, which is telling you about your vulnerabilities, but not showing you what a bad guy would do with them. It's important in penetration testing that we take those next steps to demonstrate the why it's important. And then finally, we have to gather all this up and report on it. This is the most important part of this exercise is to have reporting that very clearly demonstrates what the team was able to do and express in clear language how to remediate that in your own target environment so that you have what you need to understand the risk of what was identified, but also, and most importantly, how to address it as an organization and why it's important. So there's a lot of different types of reasons why an organization would want to do penetration testing, and there's a lot of different things that you need to be able to demonstrate that you've taken good security guidance on. So at CDW, we have a wide variety of products and services that we provide to our customers. And as a risk advisory services practice, we're tasked with identifying the ways that an organization could be attacked for any of those other things that you're talking to your CDW sales team about. And so this can be a very broad category. So at first, we need to understand what is it that we're actually targeting? What are those things that either your organization or maybe a third-party stakeholder, a customer, or an investor wants to demonstrate that has a good security posture? Are we talking about the network, your external or internal network and infrastructure, or cloud resources that you might utilize? We're talking about an application stack, so web or mobile applications that are important to how your organization does what it does. We're talking about your wireless network. So we treat that a little differently than we do other network infrastructure, because that's more so looking at what would happen if somebody showed up on site, if they're sitting in the parking lot, if they have some ability to jump into part of the network that they shouldn't access as a guest. Are there misconfigurations that they could stand up infrastructure that looks like it's your organization's that is then stealing credentials from your users or otherwise being malicious? We can also look at social engineering, which is not penetration testing because we're targeting users instead of systems, but is another part of that offensive security assessment that's important. Where that line crosses is where we simulate malware detonation off of an attachment, or taking a next step where a user takes an action and allows our team access to something. We can demonstrate that. That's where it turns into a penetration test. And sometimes that demonstration that those email security controls, your network security controls are in place as well. A little bit more targeted, but it's certainly a valuable exercise. And then finally, intelligence gathering. Some organizations will actually ask us to do this as a separate activity. We talked a minute ago about full knowledge versus zero knowledge testing. And some organizations just want to get a better understanding of what information an attacker could get about them that's available out on the internet. We've open source intelligence collection into a lot of our other testing services because we know attackers need to do that to be able to run the attacks against their environment. Sometimes that information is useful separately as well. And this is important that we're asking these questions because a majority of organizations that we've surveyed don't have a formal process that they understand vulnerabilities in their environment. They either conduct vulnerability scanning informally on an ad hoc basis or maybe not at all. And being able to understand what is vulnerable about your environment is important to know the exploit chain that would get to those things that are most important to you. And penetration testing is often a first starting point to give you that baseline so that you can know your game plan going forward to get to that good state so that you can have a continuous process. It's a good validation point. So why is this important? Well, there's a couple of reasons. And I think the biggest one is that it's a validation that the things that you've put into place as an organization, not just technology, but also people and processes, are working effectively and they're doing what you need them to do. And if not, that you identify the gaps that will help you improve that posture based on what's most important to the business. It's our job to test that these things are working effectively. At the beginning of COVID, when a lot of organizations moved to a hybrid working model, a lot of organizations needed to make major network changes to allow that access that may have been different than it was prior to people working from home. And a lot of organizations reached out to us and said, can we test this change? We don't need to change the whole network. We only changed it in this way. We want to validate that we've done that securely because we've punched a hole in our firewall. Can you help us test this? That is super important. And what we can do is then identify if there's gaps in that process change that you make to help you improve your security capabilities. So we're not going to come out here and tell you to go buy this or that vendor product. What we need to do is say, do the capabilities that you have in place, are they effective to prevent the attack that we're talking about here? Are the assumptions that you made working effectively? It's important that penetration testing is a vendor neutral activity. As I just mentioned, we're not here to tell you go buy this software or that application. It's important. We need to keep that separate so that we can focus on, have the decisions that you made worked well, and do you have a roadmap to tackle based on the attributes of the security controls that you need? Because there's often many ways to address a security problem based on where you're going to spend your time and dollars and resources. And so it doesn't make sense for us to come in and say, you should buy this thing. We say, you need this capability to help protect your organization better. And this can help drive those security priorities because we align these with business risk. We're explaining here are the things that could have the biggest negative impact to your organization. This is why we think you should spend more time and attention on this aspect of your security posture, perhaps versus others. And it's something that effectively everybody should be doing at least annually. Increasingly, regulatory requirements are making that a requirement. So if you take a lot of credit card information online and you have to be PCI compliant, it's something that you have to demonstrate that you're doing. Many industries are starting to expect in regulated senses that they're doing this as well. And the other piece of this is that we increasingly are seeing, and this is true, I'm sure, of all of you on the call, that almost every organization we talk to experiences cybersecurity attacks. 99.3% in 2021 of the customers we surveyed had experienced some sort of attack. So not necessarily a breach where data had been exposed or ransomware had been deployed, but everybody's getting targeted as an organization. And so to ensure that your front door is locked and set up properly, you need to be able to validate that. And so this is one of the reasons why penetration testing is being added to that list of requirements that you have to do business with partners, with customers in more regulated environments. And so let's talk about why we want to help build this process out and how do we determine the goals for when you're looking to do penetration testing, perhaps for the first time, or how to change it over time. So where do we start? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Are we doing this to demonstrate that compliance so we can continue to do PCI, we can continue to take credit cards online? Are we looking to assess the capabilities we have today to be able to baseline and see how we're doing? Are we looking to build a strategic roadmap because we know that we want to make changes, but we don't know where to start? Each of these outcomes may have a different focus in terms of the reason why we would do pen testing and the way that we would approach it. And so that's part of my job as a pre-sales overlay for this team is help understand what your history with penetration testing is, how confident you are in your security posture today, and what it is that you need to demonstrate. Is this something that you have to do because you need it to continue doing business? Is this something that is a proactive activity that you're using to go back to the business and justify the security expenditures you want to make? Is this something that you've made that major network change and you're validating that as a best practice? Depending on what that outcome is, we take different approaches. But in each of these cases, we're aligning our understanding of threat context to organizational risk. And organizations that effectively integrate their cybersecurity risk with their ERM risk strategies experience significantly lower attack success rates. So organizations are all experiencing attacks. Everybody is, it's getting easier and easier for bad guys to automate that. Everybody's getting probed. But organizations that have a clear understanding of how cybersecurity risk aligns with the rest of business risk that they're responsible for, they can make better decisions on where to spend the time on items that are going to materially improve their security posture. And it does affect the success rate of the attacks that they're experiencing, which is important. So once we have a good idea of where our baseline is, how do we measure the effectiveness of this, of our current posture, of our interest in changing that over time? And having been a GRC consultant myself in a past life, there's a concept between an assessment and an audit. An assessment where you go and ask somebody questions and they'll give you the responses to say, this is how I feel that we do, this is what we have in place today, this is how we feel that we're doing, versus an audit where you will say, okay, I'm glad we talked about this, but now show me evidence that this is working effectively in your environment. That's an important thing for us to suss out as well, to know, is the expectations that you have for your security program, do they work that way in reality? Once you've tested it, do things stand up the way that you would expect them to? And if there's a delta between those two, then there's a challenge with realizing the security objectives that you have. And this maturity modeling can sometimes be helpful for that. So we talked about identifying what controls are important, determining why we're doing testing in the first place, what are the crown jewels, and what are the paths to get there so that we know the scope that we're focused on. Once we have that, then we know what capabilities we need to protect those environments based on best practices, based on our understanding of what's critical to the business, both from a technology perspective, but also including people and process. So, default credentials is not necessarily a technology problem. That's a process issue where if that is, if that's built into your workflow, that is changed as part of your rolling out new software, then you're able to catch that earlier up in the pipeline than having a technology tool do that for you. And so once we have a good idea of the capabilities that we have and the ones that we need, we can use that and the gaps between those two to inform what we need to get to our desired target state. And so a roadmap is going to come out of that in terms of the tasks that we need to do. But it's also important to start thinking about how we take the activities that we do and improve them to the point that we are more confident in them over time. And maturity mapping is helpful for this because you can start to document things. You can start to train the team members on it. You can start to measure the effectiveness of this over time. And as where those things are important, you're able to continue to demonstrate your ability to improve upon it, which can be valuable to other stakeholders. Let's talk about the road mapping. So you run through a penetration test of a target environment, and we get a report that comes back that will identify what happened. It will have the executive summary at the front. It will have a narrative that talks through, how we did what we did with the screenshots and the explanations of everything. A big technical section at the back end that will talk about technical remediation recommendations and how they bubble up into categories. Once we have that, we then need to know what resources we have at our disposal so that we know how we can organize the things that are most important and tackle them in an effective way. And some of those recommendations are going to be near automatic. So if I talk to an organization and they don't have a firewall, or they don't have good anti-malware, or they are behind on vulnerability patch and configuration management, if PII is important and data protection isn't there, or if logging and monitoring are not there, or the organization is concerned about social engineering but doesn't have security awareness, those are simple conversations to have because those are the bread and butter requirements to make these conversations effective, to make these security controls effective. But there's a lot of other considerations that need to happen for many other findings that we get back on these things. So how critical a severity is the finding? Is it a high likelihood and a high impact, and it's affecting something that's business critical? Well, that's going to have a much higher priority to address than perhaps some other things that might be in the findings. On the flip side, is it something that we may have the cycles for and it is a quick win? It requires very little technology change. It's low cost. It's something the team knows how to do or can learn how to do effectively. Maybe that's adding that, rotating default credentials on your checklist when you roll out new software. We would treat that as a quick win because it's a small thing that has a big impact. Do we understand the cost in dollars, in time, and utilization of our resources in the required experience that it would take to address these findings? And is that a one-time cost? Is that an over-time cost that we have to address? Does it also, do the changes that we need to make to secure the business significantly impact the business, or do they require consultation with other stakeholders? So when we get into conversations about identity and access management, there's certainly a security component to it, but there's a lot of other business considerations that need to be brought to play to get to the right outcome. The same is true when it comes to business continuity and disaster recovery planning. IT can come up with all of the technological tools to help ensure and enforce the plan that the business makes, but they can't independently calculate what the business needs in terms of how quickly we need certain services up. That's a conversation that needs to happen that has more than a security angle to it. And by knowing these other constraints, how does that affect the priorities that we have? Because we want to make sure that the recommendations that are being laid out and structured over time are relevant, are impactful, and are something that as an organization you have the ability to tackle, or what you need to be able to address it. So let's review the sections here. So we've talked about how do we get to identifying the scope that we're focusing on. We've identified how we build that up over time, whether it's the first time you're doing it or it's something you're continuing to improve upon. It's worthwhile reminding ourselves that depending on the business that you have, it's likely that there's a blend of things here that are important to you. And that testing plan is likely going to change over time as your maturity as an organization continues to improve. So organizations that do good attack surface management, that have their vulnerability configuration and asset management down locked, that are doing that have good visibility, that roll out golden images and are doing a lot of things as a best practice, we can pivot our focus because we don't need to do as much of the vulnerability scanning and baselining for that organization because they're doing that themselves. We can focus more on the attack paths and do scenario-based testing where we expect a compromise and we say, well, what would an attacker do in different contexts to see, do our security controls protect us the way that we would expect to see? Or are we at a point now that we can start looking at advanced services where we're less focused on, are our systems set up properly and are our processes in place, to can we detect a determined attacker? Are our tools set up to light up properly when certain techniques are run? And it's a crawl, walk, run situation. You have to know where you need to prioritize first. You have to have your game plan put together first before you can grow in that direction. And that's important to us to consider. I have seen a number of questions come through, which is awesome. I will have time to get to them at the end, and I'm looking forward to that. So practice makes progress. So once you have that baseline in place, what's the next step that you want to look at? Well, that roadmap is going to lay out what it is that those requirements are, whether it's an increased focus on process to make sure that things are rolled out in a more secure way over time. Make sure that you have the tools and the resources that are in place to be able to address the things that are important to you. It also means that we can start to look at planning. So organizations who are concerned about different types of threat scenarios may also want to consider that they have a good incident response plan in place and that it aligns to the threat scenarios that they'd expect to see. These two things together help us move towards that post-compromise goal-based penetration testing, or advanced services like spear phishing, where we spend the time to identify targets and find the lures that are going to work for people like executives or VIPs in an organization, people with keys to the kingdom who you might be worried about getting targeted for these things. We're all the way through up to picking up the phone call or showing up on site to demonstrate what a determined attacker might do. Then we can move on the other side to full knowledge testing, where we're provided as much information as the defending team has, so that we can act as if the same as an attacker would who's had 6 months to case a joint. We now have the information to simulate that more effectively. On the flip side, we do covert testing, as I was mentioning a second ago, where we are less focused on giving you a full breadth of what your baseline looks like and more focused on being a sneaky covert attacker. Can we get by your security controls without them noticing it? And if we can, how do we identify where those gaps are and improve it so that next time you can't, that the team is not able to use those techniques, which is important. And for organizations that are at that stage, the other thing that they can start looking at is continuous control validation. So there's, you may have heard increasingly there's a market for called breach attack simulation, which people will call automated penetration testing. Effectively, what it is it's taking these advanced tactics, techniques, and procedures that threat actors use and run them against your target infrastructure so that you can test that for yourself. But you really do need that solid baseline, those good systems in place from a people, process, and technology perspective to get the value out of that continuous testing. But it's great if you can get to that point, because as a cybersecurity advisor, it is my goal to make it more difficult on my penetration testing team and the bad guys every time we have one of these conversations. And so the further we can help you mature your security capabilities to do that, the better off you will be, and the happier I will be as a pre-sales person for the security team, because I like giving my penetration testers a hard time. One thing to consider that's a useful tool to start thinking about attack scenarios, how we're prepared for them as an organization, is a great little card deck by the team at Black Hills Information Security called Backdoors and Breaches. Great to start thinking about threat modeling and incident handling more generally, and what's going to be important to us in terms of, do we have what we need to think about penetration testing properly, and are our systems set up to do that? It's also fun to be able to show people who may not live in that world on a day-to-day basis how to start thinking about security. Highly recommend you take a look at it if it's something that you can get your hands on. So what should you look for in a penetration test or a penetration testing partner? So we talked a little bit about what is it that you're trying to solve, because the way that we're going to get to addressing pen testing is going to look different in different types of circumstances. A compliance-based test is going to look different than one where we are focused on pushing the boundaries on what your capabilities are in your environment. Because there may be things that you don't want, and we want to help you support for a regulatory compliance reason that's only focused on the scope that they need to see, because there's compliance requirements outside of just the pen test itself, and we want to keep that scope tight. So if you are an organization that does e-commerce, we want to help you not only assess this environment, but also keep that cardholder data environment as small and well locked down as possible, so that when you get to the pen test, it's a relatively simple exercise because you're demonstrating that it's locked down and separate from the rest of your business. And we can help you validate that, as opposed to wanting to see where all of the potential gaps are in our environment for our own internal roadmap. They're just a different type of service, and the outcome is different on purpose. And so we need to get a better understanding of what that is. Likewise, is this a holistic assessment? Is this feeding into a larger security conversation, or is this tactical? Are we just checking that one network changed? Or have you changed a certain aspect of your application, but the rest is solid and you just need that part tested? Can we get granular on that as well? From a capabilities perspective, do you know what domains you need to test? And are you confident that the team knows how to tackle different types of environments based on what's important to you? Do they have a clear understanding of where the focus should be based on the threat context that you have? From a threat context, do they have a good idea of what it is that you feel that you need to be ready for, and what are reasonable expectations to include in the remediation recommendations? Also, do they have appropriate subject matter expertise from a technical perspective? Do they understand the way that your business operates if you have specific types of requirements that you have from a regulatory or an environment perspective? As an example, we do penetration testing in operational technology environments. So the easiest way I like to describe that is robots with saws and various things like that, where there's not only a technical risk to the business, but there's a potential risk of loss of life, where we have to be very careful to do testing in environments like that, because it is just different than corporate IT environments. Does the team have the expertise and capability to do testing safely in those environments? Who is the audience for the deliverables? Is it a technical team because they're validating what they did and making sure that it's working well? Is it for a client where they want to demonstrate that you as their vendor partner are up to stuff from a security perspective? Are we doing validation, or are we identifying new issues, or both? Does the reporting have effective strategic guidance? Does it have a good narrative that explains what happened so that a technical person on your team with sufficient skill could reproduce the results? Does it have good technical remediation recommendations that map to what's important to you and are reasonable, that are not asking? I saw somebody on Twitter the other day that was saying they read in a report that one of their auditors was asking them to shut down Office 365 because it connected to the internet. For many organizations, that's not a reasonable request. So does that align with what it is that you'd expect to see and is right sized for your business? Also important to think about, the test reporting itself is providing a roadmap for things that need to be improved. So what support as an organization do you need? Do you need help with your validation and remediation strategy in terms of how to tackle what's here? Is it well laid out in terms of what are the priorities? And is this a best practice, or is this tailored specific to my environment? Does the team know enough about me, and are we comfortable sharing enough about us that we can tailor this specific to us, or does it need to be mapped to those best practices? And in terms, what should I expect during the engagement itself and from the team itself? Do they have an established methodology that they're able to share with you? Are they able to demonstrate the credentials of their testing team, or where possible provide references? That one's tricky because often organizations don't want to talk about the security testing that they do, but ideally they're able to share at least some high level findings on that front. And then sample documentation. What does this look like? What is this test going to do for me? How am I going to see what the types of results are? Is the approach and complexity aligned with our testing success criteria? Do we know what we want, and is the proposal coming back to look like it lines up with that? Are they bringing the right level of depth to testing, whether it's helping us because it's our first time provide a baseline, or going all the way through to a red team where the team needs to be experts in their domains and sneaky in the process? Do they have a formal rules of engagement process where they very clearly identify the way that they're doing testing, the times that they're doing testing, getting formal approval from everybody involved, including third parties that may host your infrastructure, to make sure that everybody's on the same page? Are they able to demonstrate that they do reconnaissance and exploitation carefully, that they're not going to knock over your stuff during testing? and they're not going to be scanning things that are out of scope for the test. Do they have a demonstrated process for open communication during testing in case changes need to occur, in case the team finds something that needs to get your visibility to right away, that you might need to action right away? Is there appropriate separation of duties where, as we were mentioning, these teams need to be vendor independent, where they're not also going to be selling you stuff at the same time because their job is here to validate and assess what you're doing? All these things are important considerations. So finally, I want to take a couple minutes to introduce the risk advisory services practice here at CDW. So we talked a little bit about the fact that we have a blended team. So half of them are in the offensive security space, so doing penetration testing and social engineering activities. The other half are governance, risk, compliance, and privacy consulting folks who can help with the organizational plan that you have, help align with regulatory requirements, et cetera. And we have, education is really important to our team, both in terms of certifications. As you can see, the team spends lots of time and effort to make sure that they're keeping up with the best in breed in terms of demonstrating capabilities and experience. Additionally, knowledge share, super important, because as organizational requirements change, as regulatory bodies change, as attacks surface and threat context changes, we need to keep up with this information. And so in our practice, it's very important that we do knowledge share within the practice as well as between these practices to make sure that we're continuing to iterate and improve on our capabilities and know what's changing in the future. So penetration testing is sort of one aspect of how we understand a customer's target environment to help validate that those controls are in place. We also need to sort of think about a lot of these other aspects to say, as we were saying at the beginning, what's the purpose of why we're getting to testing in the first place? Where does this fit into the puzzle pieces for you for your security program? Is this a prerequisite state to give you an idea of where to start, or is this validating something that you've already done? And what's your short-term and medium and longer-term goals to make sure that what we're able to align is going to work best to give you the outcomes that you need? And how can we build that over time so that you're continuing to improve upon your security posture? You're taking those findings because they're right sized to your organization, they are risk focused, to demonstrate and build the plan to improve that over time and demonstrate that to your stakeholders, to your sponsors, to your partners and customers to say, we are taking this seriously. Here's how we can demonstrate that we're doing that. And lastly, the risk advisory services practice is, it exists within a larger security portfolio. So we like to be the vendor independent practice that we're here to help assess where you are today, where you're looking to go. But one of the very cool things about working at CDW is I have access to a tremendous bench of technical subject matter experts in every conceivable domain that you can imagine. And so the benefit is once we get to understanding, the challenges that exist, the gaps that you have in your environment and what you need to get to where you want to be, we can rely on those people who know those technology sets in tremendous detail, who know the strategy to address certain challenges that organizations face. And where we're invited to, we can bring those subject matter experts to the table to come up with a game plan that is tailored to what's most important to you, which is a very cool part of my job. It allows us to answer a lot of questions that we would have to, if we were a more isolated practice, we would have to identify ourselves. So now's the time I wanted to get to questions. Wanted to thank you all for spending the time with me. Two items here before I dive into the questions. Mitch.Kelsey@cdw.ca, in case you have anything that comes to you after this session, you want to talk to me about this in more detail, certainly happy to do that. cdw.ca/pentest has some additional resources. So the two National Penetration Test Day reports that identify how organizations are understanding and leveraging penetration testing today, where their concerns are, and where their goals are in that environment. If that information is helpful to you to have conversations internally, it's certainly there for you as well. So let's jump into the questions. So question, can you speak to the benefits of doing pen testing if a customer has a managed detection and response service in place? That is a good question. So part of the consideration, we talked about it at the beginning, was what is it that your concern is as an organization? Where are your security capabilities today, and what are you trying to assess? So in the case that you have a managed security service provider, it's important to understand what it is that they're covering. So an MDR vendor may only be looking at your endpoint as an example. And so there may be aspects of that environment that they don't have good visibility to. Certain steps in the attack chain that tool in and of itself may not see. Likewise, you may have gotten to a posture level where you expect that this service should be blocking and tackling effectively in the domains they're responsible for, and you want to test this. That's something that we get asked to do as a MSSP ourselves, something that others do as well. That's where we move more towards the advanced testing services to validate, can we get around this environment, as opposed to can we identify insecure configurations or out of date software in an environment. We're more looking at, can we evade and get access to the resources that we would need to as bad guys. So that tends to be more so what we focus on when an organization has a managed security service provider in place. That being said, there could be other aspects that are important to you. So maybe you have a public application that you need to look at the application stack for vulnerabilities in terms of, can users get access to information that's inappropriate? Can they dump information out of the database because the inputs are not being sanitized properly? Those details may not be captured by a managed detection and response firm at the appropriate level because they're more focused on the server that's running the application. And so some of those techniques that an attacker might use may not get picked up by a managed detection and response vendor. So it does kind of depend. It would be something we'd want to sit down and talk about, but it's certainly something to consider, that there's going to be options depending on how comfortable you are with what it is, whether you're wanting to test this vendor, whether you're wanting to see maybe what's out of scope for them, or if you're also needing to demonstrate it because it's a compliance activity. Just because you have that vendor in place doesn't mean you may not need to demonstrate that you've done your own internal due diligence in the environment, and those vulnerabilities or misconfigurations, even though they might get picked up and protected by that MDR vendor in case it was exploited, for somebody like the PCI Council, they're going to want you to demonstrate that you've patched those beforehand. So sometimes that reporting is a requirement no matter what. So that was the one technical question that I have. Have a couple minutes left, so I'm certainly happy to address others if anybody else has something they would like me to speak to now. But again, if not, feel free to reach out to me directly as well. Happy to continue the conversation offline. We'll give another minute or so in case anybody's furiously typing, but want to thank you all for spending the time with me today to learn a little bit more about penetration testing. Hopefully this was helpful. And again, looking forward to answering any questions that come up afterwards, or if there's anything we can do to talk further about it, would love the opportunity to.
Mitch, I believe someone just came in. Is it better to do pen testing in production or pre-production?
Great question. That's a great question. Generally speaking, it's good to test things in pre-production if it's something really critical to the business. But it's only important to do that if your pre-production and your production environments are very similar to each other. If they're really different, then you're not effectively testing what is out there in the world that is exposed to the internet. In those cases, production testing totally makes sense. Some cases we can't test pre-production, so production has to be the case. There's some additional safety protocols you want to take into account if you're testing in production, so you don't knock over the application, that you're less concerned about in a pre-prod environment. Something you want to talk about with your testing provider, because there's additional considerations. They might need to go slower or use different tools in a production environment. Either way, you want to make sure that you're testing as close to production as you can so that you can ensure that production environment is secure. Got another question here. How often should a pen test be done in a large organization? So the best practice for penetration testing for most circumstances, and large organizations would fall into this as well, is at least annually or after a major change. So in the event that your application goes under through a major refactoring, or like I was explaining at the beginning of the call, when COVID happened and people were making, VPN and network firewall changes, it was good to test those changes in the environment, but at least annually gets a good coverage for it. The corresponding number that people use from a vulnerability scanning perspective to identify these vulnerabilities between pen tests is quarterly at a minimum. So ideally, what that would allow you to do, as long as you're testing and scanning more regularly, is capture those, have a good prioritized roadmap for patching them. So by the time you get to the next pen test, you're focused on a new attack surface as opposed to potentially legacy vulnerabilities that now might have exploits out there that would make the pen testers' jobs more easy. Great question. Renee, anything else you see on your side there in terms of questions?
Nope, that was the last one that came in on this side. So I believe we are good on this side. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone. Mitch, thank you so much. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening or afternoon, wherever we are. And yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.